title of my talk is, Are the Real Limits to Scale a Matter of Science or Engineering or of Something Else? For many years, for many decades, computer scientists have been talking about problems in terms of scale. If you want to put down somebody's new idea, say, oh, it will never scale. But when I was given this award and had the opportunity to give this talk, I thought it might be useful to try and put together some ideas, some cross-cutting ideas to try and understand what scale is, because it's much more important generally to computer science, not just to security and dependability. And I think that what we've started to understand about the economics of dependability does have something to say. So, where do we start off? Well, a number of people sometimes refer to Anderson's law as this saying here, you can have security, functionality, or skill. In fact, you can choose any two. And this goes back, I suppose, to 15 or 20 years when we were wrestling with the problem of what would happen if you set up a national database of electronic medical records. Would it be possible to protect it? Now, functionality and scale, you can get together with online medical records, but our record of securing them is not good, as I will discuss later. Security and scale, take for example Google's Gaia logon mechanism. Billions of authentications are done every day. It's a very, very simple mechanism. Get someone's ID and password or two-factor authentication. And you get enormous benefits from scale, because if someone steals your Gmail logon and uses it in an internet cafe in Indonesia, then a big service company like Google or Facebook or Twitter or Yahoo can spot that very quickly, because they know who you are, they know where you are, they know that's a bad internet cafe, and so on. So there you can use scale to provide security of a simple function. If you have security and functionality, however, in the introduction was mentioned hardware security modules, the devices that do encryption of pins and keys for ATMs. When you try and scale that up to support too much complexity, too many different ATM networks, or indeed too many virtual machines, things tend to break horribly. So if we're going to dig down into this a little bit more deeply, we have to start figuring out what we mean by scale. And here I think views have changed over time. The classic 1960s view that was worked out by the pioneers of our field, while I was still a schoolboy, were worked out when CPUs were very, very slow. And so to do something very basic, like sorting, for example, you had to stop and think about it carefully. And so all students of computer science study the best, worst, and average case performance of things like bubble sort and quick sort and merge sort and counting sort. And this is the very stuff of a first-year computer science course. And it's not just the CPU cost, there's memory costs, and this leads in turn to complexity theory. And in the 1970s, when I started to program, we already had some work for for complexity theory to do, because commercial cryptography came along. You had Diffie-Hellman, RSA, DES. The killer app that brought cryptography out of the world of government and spooks was, of course, the automatic teller machine. ATMs appeared in the 1970s at scale when I was an undergraduate. And this, of course, got people to start thinking seriously about the complexity of attacking the underlying ciphers. And as DES had a 56-bit key length, which some people rightly pointed out was a bit short, people then started asking whether you could fix this by double encryption. Could you simply encrypt an account number using one key and then using another key, rather than having a cipher with a longer key length? And the answer, of course, is no, because if a ciphertext is the result of encrypting a message with key 2 and then key 1, then there's a very simple man-in-the-middle attack, collision attack. You decrypt C with all keys KI, and you encrypt M with all keys KJ, and you look for the match. And there's a whole theory gets built up on top of that, and complexity theory found real work to do in tidying up the ideas of cryptography. That is, still a big enterprise with hundreds of people and a number of annual conferences. The other thing that happened in the 1970s is that Moore's law started to be recognized. Although Gordon Moore actually stated it in the 1960s, it was probably by about the late 1970s that people began to realize that this was something that would drive things. So where are we now? Well, as Martin pointed out, we've now got enormously capable hardware. And we find that Bitcoin miners are doing a 64-bit search every 10 minutes. Forget the 56-bit key searches that we worried about in the 1970s. This is, a couple of orders of magnitude greater. On cryptanalysis, we reckon now, thanks to Snowden and various things that have been observed, that the agencies can solve 1024-bit discrete log problems. And there's amazing things you can do if you've got a few thousand servers sitting in a farm. You can play Go. There's all sorts of cool things that people are figuring out what to do. But where does this leave us by comparison with the computing tasks we used to worry about? Did anybody know, for example, what the highest load was in a gov.uk web service last year? According to Tom Loosemore, the Deputy Director of GDS, it was 15,000 simultaneous users registering to vote for the 2015 election, which was handled by 2 servers. And when you bear in mind that companies like Google and Amazon now measure their servers in millions, it's clear that we have solved the hardware scaling problem in some sense. Okay, let's move on to the 1980s, and there the attention changes somewhat. People had been worrying about the software crisis since the late 1960s, and by the early 1980s, guys like Barry Boehm started the systematic study of the economics of software, something that's important and probably deserves a lot more work still. And one of the things that we teach our students is that there are certain limits to how quickly you can write big programs. And Barry Boehm's law says that basically your cost optimum time to first shipment varies as the cube root of the total number of developer months. So by squaring the number of staff as the problem gets bigger, you can get some benefit, but you can't get benefits beyond that. And if you try and go too quickly, then your costs simply inflate out of sight. And as Martin pointed out, this leads to many software failures. We already in the 70s had Fred Brooks pointing out that if people are to be added to a software project, you should do it early rather than late. And he pointed out, not quite tongue-in-cheek, that if you add staff to a late software project, you can just make it later because of the extra communication and coordination costs that you impose. And finally, people then realized that only 10% of the cost of software is the initial development. The rest is in later maintenance. So this was the big problem that we started to realize in the 1980s, just as I was starting to earn my living writing software for real. And of course, in addition to this academic work, there's all the lore that you pick up in the pub afterwards, which of course goes much in the same direction. So where are we now? Well, here the news isn't good news, it's bad news. Basically, managing projects hasn't gotten any easier, and we've basically given up on the old idea that with proper software engineering discipline, with big waterfall models, with PERT charts, Gantt charts, and all the rest of it, that you could somehow build a software product as big as the Ritz. We don't do that anymore. What we've learned is that it's easy enough to automate a compact problem, such as renewing your car tax, and the government digital service has gotten good at doing that sort of thing, but replacing all Britain's benefit systems with a single one is as intractable as ever. And the universal credit project lumbers and limps on from one year to the next, despite all the fancy software engineering tools that we've got nowadays. And when you start looking around in industry, Martin talked earlier about how software in many products gets bigger and bigger. Well, the truth is that's because the software gets many more components. If you're a big company like Google or Microsoft, you go out and buy dozens of companies a year. You add in the products, you add the word processors, the spreadsheets, the maps, all the other things. You tamp them down, you make them work together properly. But fundamentally, what we do nowadays is we do incremental development. We don't do big bang stuff. And that's one of the things, of course, that limits dependability, as we'll note later. Moving on to the 1990s, what about privacy? Well, people started worrying about this from the early days, but where I first came seriously into contact with this was in 1995 when I started doing some stuff for the British Medical Association, and we produced the Blue Book, Safety and Privacy in Clinical Information Systems, in response to a government policy that there would be a single electronic patient record for all throughout the NHS, which would accumulate everything on you from the IVF clinic to the morgue and would be accessible to everybody with a need to know anything about you. Now, hang on a minute, said the doctors, this doesn't sound quite right. How should this be done? So we did some work and we came up with 8 rules to cover access control to medical records in direct care. And these were tested and implemented in some GP and hospital systems. They basically translate into fairly straightforward rules, such as a nurse can see the records of any patient who has been in her ward in the past month, and a junior doctor can see the records of any patient who's being treated by his department. But there was something that didn't fit neatly in the box, and that was, what about circumstances where it's proposed that an awful lot of people should have access to your record? And so we just put in a rule which said that people should be notified and allowed to opt out if it's proposed to add lots of people to their records access control list. And this was the bit that was always fudged. There are always reasons why more people want access to stuff. And initially, this was about administrative stuff. This was civil servants wanting to run big jobs, to do things like planning the numbers of nurses, to do things like clinical audit. Of course, research came along. How do you go about dealing with this? Well, it turned out that there's something we missed. And it's this, that there are 2 sides to privacy versus scale as a debate. The first is, what happens if too many people get access to our medical records? And we saw that in 2008 in Scotland, where emergency care records for the entire Scottish population were made available to everybody in the Scottish NHS. And pretty well as soon as this system was live, a doctor in Melrose went and looked at Gordon Brown's records and Alex Salmond's and Kirsty Wark's and various other celebrities, and this caused an enormous fuss. How can you control the risk if suddenly several tens or hundreds of thousands of people have access to something? Surely one of them will be lazy or careless or dishonest or will be using an infected PC. That is the straightforward risk that you could simply understand in classical terms. But the other risk that came along is that when you aggregate so many records together, you create too big a target. And when we put all England's records together in the hospital episode statistics database, then the lobbying from medical researchers and others for access became simply irresistible. And we had the care.data scandal last year, where about 1 billion records, that is all English hospital records going back to 1998, were sold off to about 1,200 buyers around the world. And some of these companies are still reselling our records right now. That is not a technological failure, that's an economic and political failure. Once you create a big target, the attackers will come. On a related theme, during the 1990s, we began to understand the economics and the dynamics of the IT business a fair bit better, because people started studying network effects. And one of the early formulations of this was Metcalfe's law by Bob Metcalfe, who invented Ethernet. And he said, well, the value of a network of n players scales as n squared, right? Because once there's n people in a network, each of the players in the network has got n people to talk to, and the more people you have to talk to, the more valuable it is. Now, you can quibble with the details. You could ask whether it's n log n or n log n log log n or whatever, depending on your economic model, but it certainly scales more than linearly. And what's happening here, of course, is that the benefits per user are scaling up at the same time as the average cost per user is scaling down. And the costs are largely fixed costs because they're costs of development. Remember, programming is hard. Hardware becomes ever cheaper. And there's also technical lock-in. And how do we get a view on how these interact? Well, there was a wonderful book, Information Rules, written by Carl Shapiro and Hal Varian in 1998, where a couple of serious economists basically ran their slide rule over this. And one of the results that they come up with is that the value of a software or services company is more or less equal to the total lock-in of all the users. How does this happen? Well, suppose you've got a law firm with 100 fee earners, busy writing writs and conveyances and so on, and your law firm spends $450 per seat on Windows and Office for them. Well, what would be the cost of retraining all these lawyers and trainees and associates to use LibreOffice or Google Docs, on a Linux platform or whatever, and simply converting? Well, the answer is that if it's a typical firm at the margin, the cost would be $45,000. Because if it was less, then people would switch. And if it were more, then Microsoft would put up its prices. And this was a really key insight. This was the top-selling business book during the dot-com boom. And it greatly influenced thinking in Silicon Valley. And it's been borne out by experience since, because as lock-in has decreased as we've moved to cloud platforms and diverse devices, so the amount of money that Microsoft can get for Office goes down. And various attempts to increase lock-in, such as trusted computing, have by and large failed, because by now, corporate America at least is smart enough to see these kind of games coming. So far, so good. But this is one of the things that got me seriously interested in the economics of security, because I met Hal Varian at Auckland in 2001, and we spent some hours talking together about this, and I realized that he had solutions for a number of the problems I was thinking about, and vice versa. And as I was writing the first edition of Security Engineering, I realized that much of the glue text that I needed to join together the war stories and the lessons in there was actually about microeconomics and game theory rather than about anything particularly technical. So how do these insights from microeconomics affect our business? Well, here's a summary in a nutshell. There are three things that make our industry different from, say, the market for coal or the market for potatoes. The first is that you've got network effects. The bigger a network is, the more valuable it is per user. In other words, you've got superlinear returns to scale. The second is that you've got low marginal costs, because it's writing the software at the beginning that's a difficult thing. Renting more service from Mr. Amazon as your user base grows, that's almost trivial as a cost. And finally, you've got technical lock-in. It may be technical, or it may relate to your business model, or it may relate to the behavior of other people. For example, 8 or 9 years ago, I had a couple of new research students starting, and I asked them, as one does, what they'd like to do their research on, and they said Facebook privacy, and I said, "You what?" And they said, "No, an older married guy like you might not understand this, but here in Cambridge," they said, "now all the party invitations come through Facebook. So if you're not in Facebook, you go to no parties, you meet no girls, you have no sex, you'll have no kids, and your genes will die out. It's that simple. There is a Darwinian imperative to be on Facebook, but it seems to be awful with no privacy. What can we do about it?" Now, there's an example of social lock-in, where people are locked into Facebook because everybody else is. And if everybody else had decided to be on MySpace or on Bebo or Friendster instead, then they would now have the money instead of Facebook. But that's not how things worked. Anyway, the point is that when you put together network effects, low marginal costs, and lock-in, then each of these makes dominant firm market structures more likely. And together, they make them much more likely. Now, that much was the gist of Carl and Hal's book. The realization is that these also tend to explain security failures, privacy failures, and also dependability failures, which I've not done so much work in, but I'm sure that there's an awful lot of opportunity for people to study in terms of networks. You see, how it works is this. If you're running a market race, you open up your system to appeal to complementers like app writers. While Facebook was fighting against MySpace, the name of the game was to get profitable apps on board. And what eventually saved Facebook's bacon is they got Zynga and Farmville and all that sort of stuff, games that people would play and pay money, of which Mark will get enough of a share that he could pay his programmers and build his business. But once you've won the race, you lock it down to extract rents. And we see exactly the same, for example, when Microsoft and Apple were fighting for dominance of the PC platform in 1985 or so. In order to make it easy for people to write software for your system, you see to it that your system doesn't have things like access controls that get in the way. Those came later with Windows 98. But to begin with, you see to it that your platform is the easiest platform for developers to use, and you don't let security get in the way. And we see this in one market after another. Early IBM mainframes, one protection bit, PCs, routers, phones. Remember the old Symbian platform, UIQ2? Nothing resembling access control at all. Right? Anything that the hardware is capable of, you can write a program to do. Very, very different nowadays, because you have got worlds which are locked down, and you have got mobile phone ecosystems where a significant part of the revenue is coming from the App Store. Social network systems, again, the security gets added later. And when the security does get added, it can easily end up aligned with the platform's interests more than it is aligned with the user's interests. There's some interesting work, for example, by Alessandro Acquisti on Facebook privacy, where he has, for the past 9 or 10 years, tracked the use by CMU students of the Facebook privacy settings. And every year or so, Facebook resets the privacy by opting everybody back into advertising and spam and so on. And then, of course, people have to go and find where the new privacy controls are and figure out how to use them. And when you graph the proportion of people who are using privacy controls of one kind or another, it's an elegant rising sawtooth. Basically, the user population is being trained to start taking privacy seriously. Exactly what you expect in a circumstance like that. Okay, so that was where security economics got started 15 years ago. And a number of things have taken center stage for this research community since then. There's now of the order of 150 or 200 people turn up at the annual workshop on the economics of information security. We were looking, for example, at free versus open source, free and open source versus proprietary software, reliability growth models. We're looking at the economics of responsible disclosure. But of course, one of the things that come along then is a very simple question in economics, which is the rate of interest. To what extent are you prepared to defer pleasure now in order to get pleasure in the future? That's what an economist would call rate of interest. And so one of the things that we started looking at was the initial costs and maintenance costs of security protocols. Because when you think about it, security for machinery is very different from security for people. You can't remember when you decided to trust your mother. You probably can't remember when you met your best friend, right? In real life, security is something that grows, and trust, if you remember the J.M. Barrie play Peter Pan, Peter Pan has the fairy Tinker Bell who's about to fade away and die because not enough people believe in her. And if people believe in some particular source of trust or goodness or whatever, then it thereby acquires power. That's how human spaces work. But when we build stuff using protocol tools, we tend to think of something like TLS or Kerberos or whatever, where you start off by setting up trust and you then assume it's going to be okay forever afterwards. And here we tend to get it wrong, because people have traditionally gone for mechanisms such as public key mechanisms, which lower the cost of initial trust establishment, but at the cost of making revocation later very, very difficult. And now we've got a whole morass with the authentication infrastructure, with the certification authorities that are packed in your browser. And basically the only way we can revoke a bad key is by recompiling the browser with a different certificate store and then pushing it to billions of users. That's perhaps a classic example of how we took a very, very strange decision. We also find that as people discover more and more bugs in TLS, then fixing these bugs is next to intractable. Why? Because if you've still got 3 or 4% of the world's population using IE version 6, then what merchant is going to voluntarily say goodbye to 3 or 4% of his customers by forcing an upgrade on all his servers? So we end up with a very, very serious legacy problem because we are not thinking about the relative costs of doing things now and the relative costs of doing things in the future in anything like a rational way. And this is, of course, tied up with what we were talking about earlier of the rush to market. And in fact, in the case of protocols, this is actually entirely impersonal because the fact that TLS defeated SET 15 years ago in the market was not something that any particular individual or organization planned. So again, we can understand perverse things that happen by looking at the incentives and by looking at how stuff scales. Another new view that came along 10 years ago is that we saw the beginning of phishing. We saw the beginning of spear phishing, at least at scale. And one of the things underlying this was that online crooks started to get organized. 20 years ago, if you had some guys doing cash machine fraud, you'd typically find that there were 2 or 3 guys who had built their own card reader writer device, who had figured out how to clone cards, and who were going round in a van, you know, perhaps with a video camera, watching people's pins over their shoulders, and they were standing in line at the cash machine at 2 in the morning taking money out. It was all very much a vertically integrated cottage industry. And that only goes so far, because eventually the cops catch you. But what suddenly started to happen, coming out of Russia and the Ukraine, was that the crooks started to get organized. Underground markets came about where people who were good at writing malware could sell their malware to people who would organize cash out, to other people who would make ATM skimmers and sell them by mail order. And all of a sudden, you had people being able to specialize and get good at their jobs in the underground, just as happened in the real world in the middle of the 18th century. Now, if you've ever read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he describes a pin factory in 1750s Scotland, where instead of having a blacksmith making a few dozen pins a day by drawing out the wire himself and cutting it and so on, you've got a factory with half a dozen people where one guy draws the wire and another guy hammers the heads and another guy sharpens the points and another guy puts the pins in little pieces of paper. And as a result, half a dozen people working together can produce thousands of pins a day. And that's exactly what we started to see 10 years ago, only it's bank pins this time rather than metal pins. And so for cybercrime to scale up, what was needed was the availability of decent tools, just like in the real economy. Because once the technically difficult thing of writing the malware can be dealt with, then people whose gift is fraud, people with the gift of the gab, can then take over the task of persuading people to install this in their systems. They can then use the bank credentials that they've harvested and sell them to yet another bunch of bad guys who will go and organize people to visit banks in Latvia or whatever. And the whole thing comes together in a way that nobody thought would be feasible 20 years ago. So everything's scaling up. Sometimes stuff has hindrances in scaling up because of the costs of developing software. And sometimes, in order for example, crime to scale up, you need a mechanism, a market, to bring various bad guys together so they can specialize. In general, the mainstream view in the business is that once you get a certain level of platform, a certain level and kind of platform, this is a platform for innovation that enables explosive growth and scaling up of all sorts of new businesses. So, round about the late 1990s, we suddenly had enough people with PCs and broadband that you could see companies like YouTube and Facebook and so on getting founded and starting to make lots of money. And then, round about 5, 7, 8 years ago, we started seeing mobile phones making a new wave possible. And we're now seeing things like Google Maps and Uber and Airbnb and mobile payments, which are transforming the third world. And this is all very well and good. But some of these happen faster than others, and some have difficulty in scaling. So this prompts us to ask again, are there limits to scale other than the available infrastructure? Well, there's a number of answers to that. One of them is about locality. One of the things that we've studied in security engineering is how is it that some security products take off and others don't? Dozens and dozens and dozens of companies have been set up to sell encryption stuff. I've had a couple. Very few have made any serious money. The few that have taken off, PGP, GPG, for example, took off in closed communities like certs, but it didn't take off globally. SSH takes off thanks to X-session teleportation. It's giving people in a business a real benefit in that the sysadmins can come in from home and fix stuff. WhatsApp gives benefit because it enables people to do group chat and it saves them text costs. Each of these are giving local benefit. They're giving local benefit to individual companies, to groups of people working in a particular trade across companies like sysadmins, or to groups of individuals, friends who want to chat on WhatsApp. That works. What doesn't work is where you need a vast global scheme where everybody's got to be coordinated, like the SET scheme for e-commerce 15 years ago, which would have required basically all the world's banks to coordinate in issuing certificates and other good things to their customers, both retail and merchant. Even rolling out something like chip and pin has taken over a decade, and it's not complete in all countries. So doing something like SET, where the benefits would have flowed largely to online merchants rather than to banks, that was never even a starter. So the first thing that you need is you need local incremental benefit. Now there's a flip side to this, which is that in addition to local incremental benefit, if you're going to get the police to take any attention, any notice of something, you need to have sufficient local harm for it to cause enough annoyance that they'll go and do something. Here's something that we've observed in Cambridge, that as many as half of the flats to let ads in Craigslist are dodgy. You can easily find a dodgy flat ad. You just copy the text into your favorite search engine, and if you find 27,000 copies of it elsewhere, same flat to rent in Cambridge, Oxford, Brussels, Dublin, Lund, everywhere, then that is a dodgy flat rental. And we started paying attention to this after one person who came to work at the lab got scammed and another almost got scammed. And we found that in Cambridge there's about 50 victims a year being reported to the university or the police. Typical loss is, a month's rental, 700 quid, something like that. So the police view is, here's your crime number, next please. Now hang on a minute. So we went and we answered 1,000 of these ads, and we did some analytics and ran the numbers. And we found that the UK total is about £5 to £10 million a year. And about half of this seems to be taken by one gang that seems to be operating out of Brussels and using bank accounts in Ireland. And about half of their takings are within the M25. So you would expect that you could get the Metropolitan Police interested. Well, we tried. 2 or 3 million a year of losses is just not enough pain, to get detectives onto planes to Brussels and Dublin and try and break down some doors. So locality is an issue for the bad guys as well. If you can prevent your crime creating any hotspots within the purview of a force that might do something about you, then you can probably get on with being a bad guy for many, many happy years to come. Here's another example. One of the things that we've been doing is trying to figure out ways in which you can make mobile phone payments in the less developed countries not depend on the underlying GSM network, so that you can do transactions off network in remote forest mountains where there's network congestion and so on. And so we've been looking at mobile phone payment systems, and it turns out that one of the significant barriers to market entry and to scaling is the fact that in many villages in less developed countries, there's only one shop. right? There's one guy who's got some bags of rice and tins of oil and matches and so on, and you know, he goes off to town once a week or whatever and gets supplies. And he ends up being the guy who becomes the agent for mobile phone units and thus for the local mobile money system, which leads to monopoly. And so in Kenya, which is one of the first countries into the mobile money revolution, last year the Competition Authority of Kenya passed a law saying that if you have got a network of mobile money agents, then it's also got to be able to serve other mobile money providers as well. Pretty much like what we've got in the UK now, with pubs no longer being tied to serve one brand of beer, particularly when in many villages in Britain there seems to be only about one pub left. So there's an example where scaling is held up by real-world infrastructure. Because what's actually going on here is that many of the things that scale quickly because they can share infrastructure, because you can share the fact that people have got PCs and broadband, and you set up something like YouTube. You can share the infrastructure that people are carrying around in their pockets with their mobile phones and set up something like Uber. But if there's any block on that sharing, then of course that's a block on scaling the thing as well. So finally, Martin was referring to intelligence and law enforcement post-Snowden and the Investigatory Powers Bill. Well, one of the things that we observe is that network effects are now starting to work in the intelligence world as well. If you go back to the 1980s, India, although it was a democracy, would go and buy many of its warplanes from the Russians because the lock-in isn't too great. If you want to switch from Sukhois to Mirages, for example, you have to retrain your pilots and buy some spares, but it's not a complete killer. Nowadays, however, we've learned from Snowden that India is sharing its intelligence with the NSA rather than with the FSB. Why? Because the NSA has got a network this big and the FSB has got a network this big. You're completely mad to go and share your intelligence assets with a small network if you can plug into a bigger one instead. And as a result, the Five Eyes countries, the countries that share NSA intelligence, are 15 or 30 or even 65 eyes, depending on which way you look at which documents. That is interesting, and it's also concerning. The economics of intelligence underneath, of course, are driven by the concentration in the industry. The fact that so much good stuff is waiting to be pinched or coerced from Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, Facebook, etc., made the PRISM program entirely foreseeable, except in its details. And the concentration of the telecoms industry, of course, led to tempora. And that's, in fact, been going on for quite some time because telecoms has always been concentrated to some extent. But intelligence has got the same high fixed costs, low marginal costs, and legacy lock-in, just like the rest of IT. So we can expect intelligence to start behaving in the same way as a big service firm. But what about law enforcement? In the old days, the police could go and get call detail records and figure out who had phoned whom and what the patterns of communication were between your South London villains or whoever was of interest. But nowadays, there are hundreds of ways to communicate: Gmail, Facebook, WhatsApp, lots of more recondite messaging services, things that you can turn to use for messaging. World of Warcraft, for example. So how do you go about making sense of this? Well, the police already have significant difficulty when they try and take down bad websites because they don't have the necessary professional skills, they don't have the reach. The typical small police force just doesn't know how to deal with several hundred registrars, hosting companies, and so on and so forth. So what's the likely outcome when the police decide that they need to somehow cut through the thicket of all the various ways that people use to communicate? Well, where is the last short resource? Well, ultimately, the thing that we can't re-engineer in anything like a hurry is the human brain. And we've got two systems: the rational system that we use when writing software and stuff, and then there's the emotional system, which we use for instant reactions. It's what kept us alive for millions of years before we were sentient. And only the former can multiprocess. And that's one of the reasons that trust is a difficult thing. If you are angry, then it's difficult to process stuff, about empathy and love and so on. And if you're hungry, then your emotions of whatever else you're thinking about are going to be colored by that. Now, one of the things that we may have got wrong is that we engineers have tended to duck the problem of trust by defining a trusted system in technical terms as one that could cheat you. But in human terms, it's one that won't. And psychology is where scale actually becomes hard. And this brings me to the Investigatory Powers Bill, which has been getting its second reading in Parliament today, and to everybody's great disappointment is not being opposed by all the opposition parties. And this is basically, among other things, going to criminalize any company that fails to hack on demand, or for that matter, any person who fails to hack on demand. So if you have got a product out there, a messaging system, a mobile phone, an app, anything that the government wants to use as a means for police access to people's stuff, then they will simply be able to serve you with a technical capability notice, and you'll have to provide not just a backdoor, but if required, a means for using your product to install government malware on some targeted individual stuff. And this sentence I pinched from an article by Duncan Campbell in Computer Weekly this morning. If passed unchanged, it would mean that no British IT product providing communications, including games, apps and services, as well as supposedly secure software systems, could truthfully and legally be marketed as secure. That is the threat that the Investigatory Powers Bill poses to our industry. So here's an interesting thing. You've got an accountability gap. And it's something that I think we can understand given the dynamics of how things scale. Silent intelligence collection, the kind of stuff that GCHQ and the NSA do, whereby you wiretap the backbone and coerce the majors, it scales far too well because of multiple network effects. And we now see the NSA building big data centers like Google or Microsoft or whatever. But on the other side, the accountable evidence collection, the stuff that the cops do, knock and show and seize, scales too badly because of the fragmentation of platforms that people use and because of national jurisdictions. So what's going to happen if Theresa May decides that she wants to demand that Apple provide a backdoor into your iPhone? Well, the text in the bill says that she can serve Apple with a secret technical capability notice, which Apple can resist if either it's technically infeasible or if it's against the law in the country of domicile. But if the FBI succeeds in defeating Apple in court in the USA, and the tools are provided, then of course that defense falls away, and all of a sudden you will see that Britain and France and the Netherlands, and then Italy, and then Greece, and then Egypt, and then every country on earth is going to pass a law saying that Mr. Apple has got to give them burglary tools to break into iPhones. What happens then? Hey, that's anybody's guess. But the fundamental problem is this, that we as humans need trust anchors, right? Because of the way our brains work, because of the scale of the stuff that's out there that we have to deal with somehow. And anything that becomes popular as a trust anchor is likely to be a target. And sensible firms are going to have to find some way to push back somehow. So, I said I'd talk about scaling, and scaling, I think, explains a lot. It explains why costs are ever more software rather than hardware. That, I think, we've understood since at least the 1980s. It explains monopolies and market races, which we've understood since the 90s. It explains why security is usually an afterthought, which was one of the early insights from security economics. It explains why most add-on security products fail, because they don't give enough local and incremental benefit. It explains why the police ignore most cybercrime, because there isn't enough local pen to get the local police commissioner off his behind. It explains why intelligence is eating law enforcement, because the way they do business scales very much better than the way the police do business. And finally, it explains why it's Apple and Google and Facebook that are standing up for our rights while governments try to undermine them. And isn't that the most strange and unexpected thing? Normally, you expect that it's companies that are trying to rip people off, that are trying to gouge their consumers and get every advantage that they can in the marketplace, whereas it's governments are putting in the regulation, governments are putting in the consumer protection, the investor protection, and everything else. Yet here, the game has been flipped around entirely. So finally, how does this affect us as researchers? How should you do it right? Well, we as researchers also have to work at scale. For example, we've set up a Cambridge Cybercrime Centre to collect all sorts of data on fraud and abuse, on spam and phish and malware and so on. And we want this to be a collection of data that other academics can use, and we'll rate our success not by the number of papers we write using the data, but by the number of papers that have been written over the next 5 years by other people using our data. And the goal is to make research into cybercrime a science, because at present what happens is somebody who wants to do a PhD goes out and spends 2 years drinking beers with people who've got access to data to persuade them that he's a nice chap, and eventually he gets some data, he runs his analytics, writes his PhD and goes away, and nothing is left behind. Nothing is repeatable, right? So what we want to do is to create a center that will have the data that people can come back to again and again and again, run new tests, try new ideas. But how do you deal ethically with data that's likely to be contaminated with personal information? Now, as far as the law is concerned, if a big service, if you have got email service with a big service firm and you press the report spam button, that's no longer personal information and they're perfectly entitled to hand it to us for research. But in practice, of course, people press the button by mistake. So we have to assume that this is personal data. We have to see to it that everybody signs an NDA, and we have to see to it that it's all whiter and white. And so one of the things that we did last year is that with a dozen other people, I wrote a report for the Nuffield Bioethics Council, which was targeted on how you cope ethically as a medical researcher with a world that's got cloud-based medical records on the one hand and pervasive genomics on the other hand. And we're coming to the realization that this actually provides a framework of much more general applicability for dealing ethically with large quantities of data where there's personal data mixed in there and one has to deal with it in a whiter than white way. And so the sort of rules we have, basically there are 4 principles: that expectations about how data should be used should be grounded in respect for persons. In other words, you never see people's medical records or even their spam feeds as simply an industrial raw material. You have to bear in mind that this has got real stuff about real people. Second, it should be determined with regard to established human rights, because our societies are machines with wheels that turn at different speeds, and constitutional rights and human rights law are, for very good reasons, the slowest turning of these wheels and represent an accumulation of wisdom about people's expectations at the deepest level. Third, they should be set with the participation of people who have morally relevant interests, which means that you should tell people what you're going to do before you do it, and not just a few of your mates on the Research Ethics Committee either. And finally, there's got to be effective and morally justified systems of governance and accountability, which means that when you screw up, you've got to own up. There's got to be breach reporting, and you've got to see to it that you make available to the public all the research that you do using this data. And colleagues of mine at the Cambridge Cybercrime Centre have been doing this for a while now with Device Analyzer, which is basically an app that people volunteer to run on their mobile phones. This is something that people put on with consent. We remind them every month that they're running this app. We've got a web page there where you can go and look at all the papers that have been written with it. But it is an extremely useful resource because it means that if we find, for example, that the factory reset on the following makes of Android phone don't work, we can then press the button and say, aha, 347 million people worldwide are vulnerable. So there are good things that you can get from big data, but if you're going to keep on having access to that data, then you have to be very careful about how you deal with it and not deal with it in the sort of way that the Home Secretary is proposing to deal with everybody's phones and other stuff. So scale is important. Scale is an awful lot more than technical. Scale is ever more about economics and psychology because the engineering stuff we've got licked, apart from the software engineering, which is perhaps intrinsically intractable given the complexities that we're dealing with. And it's something to which we have to pay attention, not just from the point of view of abstract research and policy and so on, but from the point of view of the research that we do using big data, and more of us are going to be doing research of this kind. So yes, we believe there are ways forward, but to do it right, you have to understand what the problems are, and you have to understand how stuff scales in a world where you have got more and more of the data is data about people who care about it. And so if you want more, we've got a blog and the workshop on the economics of information security at Berkeley this summer is where people interested in these topics get together and present recent research. And finally, there's the Nuffield report, which you can download and go through. Thanks.